Hi, SkySun here from SkySunStudios.com, and today I'd like to do a compression basics tutorial series. I'll be using Studio One as my DAW, and what I've done here today is I have recorded an electric guitar rhythm part, and I've run it through a plugin called Amp Lion Pro. It's an amp simulation software. I'm liking the way this sounds. It's something new I just picked up. And then I also have M Equalizer from Melda Production, and all it's doing is removing some of the low end with a high pass filter. Alright, so the guitar is going through that stuff, but now I think I want to compress it and even out the performance a little bit. So I'm going to choose Studio One's compressor, and here it is. Now I've changed the default, so if you come in here and you have look ahead on and you have adaptive on, I would recommend turning off both of those. Turn off adaptive and turn off look ahead. So you have just a simple compressor where the knobs, whatever you set the knobs to, the compressor is going to behave that way. Alright, so in Studio One's compressor, you have a lot of knobs. Let me start with the simple stuff. You have input gain. And the input gain, you can turn it up to increase the level of what's going into the compressor. And the output gain, you can use it to increase the signal after the compressor does its job. So those are simple. Let's see, you also have a ratio knob, a threshold knob, a knee knob, that's for a hard knee or a soft knee, and you have an attack knob and a release knob. I'm not going to get into the side chain in this tutorial, but it's good to know that it does have a side chain. Now, what is compression? Compression is a way of decreasing the dynamic range of a recording or a signal. So what a compressor does, if you can imagine some guy on a mixer somewhere, a compressor, it's like a guy that's riding the fader. So when it gets louder, he's going to turn that fader down so it doesn't get too loud for the mix. And then when it gets softer, he's going to turn the fader back up and it's going to sound more even. So a compressor is like some dude that you hired to ride the fader, turn down the loud stuff and turn up the quiet stuff and make an even performance for you. Alright, so a compressor follows rules. You set the rules, and that guy is going to man that fader, and he's going to do what you tell him to do. So it's pretty simple, but it can get complicated. It can seem complicated. But for starters, I just want to show you the threshold. This is probably the first thing anybody should learn about a compressor. If you take it all the way up to 0 dB, then there will be no compression no matter what you do with any of the other knobs. Okay, so if you have a threshold of 0, you're going to get no compression. So that's why I think that's a good place to start, because if you lower the threshold, then once the signal passes this threshold, if you see here, this circle represents the threshold. So I set the threshold, let's say minus 20 dB. And so anytime the volume of the performance gets above that threshold, then that guy is going to turn it down for you. Alright, and that can be very useful in a mix to have a more even performance. Alright, so if you go really low, then you're going to get more compression because more of the signal is above the threshold. In this case, it's always compressing because the signal is always above the threshold. Now, let me take it back up to something more reasonable. Alright, so what about the ratio? The ratio has to do with how much that guy turns it down once it gets too loud. So once your guitar or piano or whatever gets louder than the threshold, then you can set the ratio to have it turn down as much or as little as you want. So as you see the visual here, watch this. The signal that's above the threshold, if I set it to say 5 to 1, then it's going to turn down stuff a lot. But if I turn it to a ratio of 2 to 1, then it's going to turn it down less. Alright, so what about the knee? The knee is how the compressor behaves. This has a lot to do with the behavior of the compressor, especially right around the threshold. Okay, so for beginners, you probably don't need to mess with the knee. You know, get used to threshold, get used to the ratio knob, and attack and release. I'll cover that shortly. But the knee, basically, it has to do with how the compressor behaves around the threshold. With a soft knee, if I turn the knee all the way up, then I have a soft knee, and it's nice and natural sounding. That one might be a little too soft. But if I go all the way down, then what you have is a hard knee. So right here, it's like at a point. So everything below this threshold would not be compressed. And then right above the threshold, everything is going to be compressed at a 2 to 1 ratio with a hard knee. That's a hard knee setting. That's as hard as the knee gets in Studio One's compressor. All right. And if you increase the knee, you'll see that this line gets smoother. It's not a point here at the threshold. It's more gradual. Okay. Now, the attack and release, basically, they affect how the compressor does its job over time. So, once the signal gets above the threshold, let's say you have an attack of 400 milliseconds, then once the signal goes over the threshold, once the recording and the levels go above the threshold, then the compressor will wait 400 milliseconds, and then it will start turning it down. Then that guy will start turning down the fader after 400 milliseconds. That's a long attack. But if you go for a shorter attack, let's say 3 milliseconds, then the normal sound of the recording will be left alone for 3 milliseconds, and then the compressor will start doing its job. Then the guy will start turning down the fader. So it can make things sound natural when you have a little bit of an attack, because the beginning of the sound will come through the compressor unaffected. All right? Now, the release has to do with, after the compressor is done compressing, how long the compressor will take to let go of the recording and let the fader go right back up. So the release time has to do with when the guy lets go of the fader and puts everything back to 0. All right, so you have threshold. Threshold of 0 is no compression, because the signal cannot go past 0 dB full scale. Then if you take it down, you can begin to get compression. And the ratio has to do with how much the guy turns the fader down. All right? And then the knee has to do with how the compressor behaves, its attitude towards the signal. All right? The attack has to do with how long the compressor will wait before it starts compressing. And the release has to do with how long the compressor will take before it lets everything go back to normal. So I hope that's given you an overview of what these knobs do. One last thing, if you have a ratio of 1 to 1, then you will always get no compression. If you have a threshold of 0 dB, then you will always get no compression. And so if I mess around with this knee knob, I'm not going to get compression no matter what I do. If I change the attack and the release, nothing's going to change. If I change the release over here, like I said, nothing is going to change. So the ratio and the threshold, you have to lower your threshold if you expect to get any compression, and then you have to have a ratio of more than 1 to 1 in order for there to be compression. So it is very possible to put a compressor on something and not being compressing it at all. So just want you to understand that threshold has to be lower than 0 and the ratio has to be more than 1 in order for a compressor to compress. All right, and then after you set all your settings, you can turn up this gain knob. This is called the output gain or the makeup gain, and you can turn everything up, back up. So a compressor turns down the louder stuff, and then you can use the gain knob to turn up the signal so that it sounds about as loud as it did before. All right, so that's how that works. I hope you've learned a few things about compression. I plan to do a couple more vids, so come back for more from SkySun.